In the fall of 1918, a silent killer was sweeping the globe. But in America, a nation torn by prejudice, another battle was being waged. This is the story of a woman told she wasn't worthy to serve her country, right up until the day her country needed her to save it. This is the story of the call that turned a black nurse's world upside down. The year is 1918. The world is bleeding from the Great War, and just as the guns fall silent, a new enemy emerges. It travels on a breath of air, a phantom menace respecting no borders, class, or race. They call it the Spanish flu. It starts with a fever and an ache in your bones. Then your lungs fill, and your skin turns a dusky, purplish color. Doctor's name, heliotrope cyanosis. It's the color of suffocating. In American cities, the dead are collected by the cartload. Theaters, schools, and churches are shuttered. Hospitals are overflowing, their hallways lined with the sick and dying, the sound of coughing a constant drumbeat of despair. In this moment of crisis, the nation makes a startling discovery. It is desperately, fatally, short of nurses. They are the last line of defense, the only real weapon against a virus that medicine can't cure. Good nursing, keeping patients warm, hydrated, and clean, is the one thing that can mean the difference between life and death. But in America, not every hero was allowed on the battlefield. For thousands of women, years of training and the very oath they took meant nothing. Because their hands, their faces, their entire beings were the wrong color. This is the story of one of those women, a wall of prejudice, and a single, desperate phone call. Before the pandemic silenced city streets, another silence echoed in the life of every black nurse in America. It was the silence of a slammed door, a rejection letter. A nation that saw your skill but chose to see only your skin. Let's call her Esther. Her story is the story of thousands. She chased her calling to one of the few chronically underfunded nursing schools open to black students, like Providence Hospital in Chicago or Freedman's Hospital in Washington, D.C. These schools were beacons, founded by black communities because the white establishment refused to train them. Esther's education was second to none. She learned anatomy, hygiene, and pharmacology. She mastered sterile techniques and graduated at the top of her class, a professional ready to save lives. And America told her, no. The rejection came in many forms. A polite letter from a hospital explaining they had no facilities for colored nurses, or the dismissive glare of an administrator. Professional organizations that should have been her allies, like the American Nurses Association, were often impossible to join. Membership required being part of a state association, and most southern states, and many in the north, simply barred black nurses. It was a system built to keep her out. The deepest cut came from the American Red Cross. When the U.S. entered World War I in 1917, the Red Cross became the official recruiter for the Army and Navy Nurse Corps. It was the ultimate call to service. Esther, along with thousands of other qualified black nurses, answered that call and were denied. The military claimed it couldn't provide separate, segregated quarters for black nurses overseas. The message was clear. The color of their skin was a bigger threat than an enemy's bullet. The frustration was a simmering anger. Ada B. Toms, a leader in the National Association of Colored Graduate Nurses, NACGN, lobbied tirelessly, demanding recognition. She pointed out the bitter irony. Black men were drafted to die for a democracy that refused to let black women heal them. The NACGN, founded in 1908 precisely because of this exclusion, became the voice for these silenced women. So Esther worked where she could, in underfunded colored wards or as a private nurse. Every day was a reminder of the wall built around her ambition. She was qualified, capable, and ready. All she could do was wait for a crack in that wall, for a moment when the world's desperation might finally outweigh its prejudice. The fall of 1918 should have been a time of relief as the Great War sputtered to a close. But a far deadlier war was just beginning. The second wave of the Spanish flu arrived not with a bang, but with a cough that echoed from Boston to San Francisco. This was no ordinary flu. It moved with terrifying speed. A person could feel fine at breakfast and be dead by nightfall. The virus was most lethal to the strongest, healthiest people in the prime of their lives. The numbers were staggering. In October 1918 alone, nearly 200,000 Americans died. In Philadelphia, morgues ran out of coffins, and priests drove carts through the streets, calling for families to bring out your dead. The healthcare system, already strained by war, simply broke. Doctors were humbled and helpless. They had no vaccine, no cure. In this chaos, the true value of a nurse became as clear as life and death. While doctors could only diagnose and despair, nurses could act. They bathed feverish bodies, forced fluids, managed delirium, and turned patients to keep their lungs from filling. They worked 18-hour days, often until they collapsed or the virus claimed them too. The demand for help became a primal scream. Newspapers ran desperate ads, help wanted, nurses, nurses, and more nurses. Red Cross chapters begged for volunteers. And in her segregated world, Esther read the news. She heard the stories. She could feel the tectonic plates of a desperate nation starting to shift. The sheer force of the crisis was pressing down on the great unyielding wall of American prejudice. She knew, with a certainty that settled deep in her bones, that the wall was about to crack. The only question was, would it happen in time? The call came on a cold day in late 1918. The war was over, but the flu raged on. The phone's ring was sharp, insistent. The voice on the other end was clipped, formal, urgent. It was a man from the American Red Cross, a voice she never expected to hear. He didn't apologize or acknowledge the rejections. There was no time. He spoke of the catastrophic shortage of nurses at military camps, where soldiers who had survived the trenches of France were now dying in their bunks. He described overwhelmed medical staff, a system at its absolute breaking point. Then came the words she had waited a lifetime to hear, delivered not as an invitation, but as a battlefield commission. The War Department has authorized the appointment of a limited number of colored nurses to the Army Nurse Corps, he said. Your name is on the list. You are to report to Camp Sherman, Ohio. Can you serve? Silence hung in the air, thick with years of injustice. It was a dizzying moment. The same institution that had called her unworthy was now pleading for her help. She wasn't their first choice. She was their last resort, a tool to be used now that their preferred options were exhausted or dead. The bitterness of it was a sharp taste in her mouth. It would have been justified to say no. But then her duty rose up, stronger than the anger. A nurse doesn't run from the sick. A nurse runs toward the suffering. The men dying in those camps were just men, and she had the skills to save them. Ada Toms and the NACGN had fought for this moment. It wasn't the glorious equal entry they had dreamed of, but it was an opening, a foot in the door that had been slammed shut. She took a breath. Her voice, when it came, was steady. Yes, she said, I can serve. That single word was a revolution. For Esther and for the 17 other black nurses who got that same desperate call in December of 1918, it was the moment their world turned upside down. They were no longer invisible. They were soldiers, heading to the front lines of a war that America was losing, armed with skill, courage, and a chance they had been denied for far too long. Arriving at Camp Sherman, Ohio was like stepping onto another planet. The camp was a sprawling city of wood and tar paper, and the air carried a constant hacking chorus of coughs. For Esther and the other black nurses, the welcome was as cold as the winter wind. They were officers in the U.S. Army Nurse Corps, but even in desperation, the Army clung to its prejudice. While they would nurse both black and white soldiers, their living quarters were, as mandated, separate and isolated, a clear signal that they were seen as necessary but not equal. White supervisors and doctors looked at them with suspicion and hostility. They were watched constantly, their skills second-guessed, and they were often handed the most grueling tasks, cleaning bedpans, preparing bodies for the morgue, and working night shifts in the chaotic wards where the death rate was highest. It was a test designed to see if they would break. They didn't break. Trained in underfunded schools, they were used to adversity. They met hostility with quiet, unshakable professionalism. Their uniforms were immaculate, their work precise, their compassion boundless. The soldiers were the first to notice. Lying in their cots, delirious with fever, they didn't see color. They saw a calm face and felt a cool hand on a burning forehead. One of the nurses, Clara Rollins, became a favorite in the wards for her competence and kindness. Esther, too, found her footing by focusing entirely on the men she was there to save. She found allies in unexpected places, a young doctor impressed by her keen eye, a seasoned white nurse tired of the pointless division. Most importantly, she found strength among the other black nurses. In their segregated barracks, they formed an unbreakable bond. Their shared quarters, meant as a tool of segregation, became their sanctuary. They proved their worth 100 times a day, noticing subtle shifts in a patient's breathing or organizing their wards with an efficiency that made them indispensable. Slowly, grudgingly, cracks appeared in the wall of contempt. A head doctor might ask Esther's opinion. A white nurse might quietly ask for help. They were small, monumental victories, earning respect one saved life at a time. The turning point came at the peak of the crisis. A fresh, more virulent wave of the virus ripped through the camp. The main hospital was in chaos. Esther was in a segregated ward when an urgent message came. There was an emergency in Ward A, a large ward for white soldiers. The head nurse there had collapsed from the flu, and her junior nurses were overwhelmed. The ward's supervising doctor, a man known for his skepticism of the new nurses, was losing control. A runner appeared, his face pale. The doctor needs another nurse in Ward A now. Anyone. Esther secured her ward and walked swiftly to the main hospital. The scene was worse than she'd imagined. Men were groaning, and 2 young nurses rushed frantically between beds. The doctor saw her, his face tight with a conflict between desperate need and ingrained prejudice. Desperation won. "You," he barked, pointing to a row of cots. "Those men are crashing. Do something." In that corner, the battle would be won. One soldier was in a violent delirium. 2 others showed the terrifying heliotrope cyanosis, their breathing shallow. They were drowning. With supernatural calm, Esther took command. She ignored the panic and focused. First, the delirious soldier. She spoke in a low, steady voice and repositioned him, keeping him from harm. Then, she turned to the cyanotic patients. "Help me turn them," she directed the other nurses with firm authority. "On their sides, we have to try and drain the fluid." She worked quickly, her hands sure and practiced, propping the men up, clearing their airways and forcing sips of water. For what felt like an hour, she moved from cot to cot, a beacon of calm. The doctor found himself watching her. He saw the way she anticipated needs, the efficiency of her movements, the quiet authority with which she guided the others. He saw a professional of the highest caliber. Slowly, the corner stabilized. The breathing of the 2 men deepened, the purple tinge on their skin receding. They were still critically ill, but they were alive. When the immediate crisis passed, the ward was quieter. The doctor approached her, his face unreadable. "Nurse," he said, his voice quiet but clear. "What is your name?" "Esther," she replied. He simply nodded. "Good work, Nurse Esther." It wasn't a medal, but in that room, it was everything. It was pure, undeniable recognition. In that moment, her skill had shattered a barrier. She hadn't been a black nurse. She had been the best nurse, and everyone knew it. As winter turned to spring in 1919, the virus receded. At Camp Sherman, the coughing subsided and the wards began to empty. Esther and the other 17 black nurses had served with distinction. But as the crisis passed, so did the brief moment of forced inclusion. The Army, no longer desperate, honorably discharged the black nurses. There were no offers of permanent positions, no move to integrate the nurse corps. The door cracked open by the pandemic was quietly swung shut again. Esther returned to a tense nation. The summer of 1919 would not be a time of peace, but of fire and blood. It would be known as the Red Summer. Racial tensions, fueled by job competition and a resurgent Ku Klux Klan, exploded into violence. The brutality in Chicago was sparked when a black teenager, Eugene Williams, drifted across an invisible color line at a segregated beach and was stoned by a white man until he drowned. The city erupted. For nearly a week, white mobs roamed the streets of the Black Belt on the south side, attacking black people and burning their homes. It was a new kind of war, and once again, black nurses were on the front lines. Provident Hospital, the historic black-owned institution, was overwhelmed with casualties. Esther, a veteran of one national crisis, found herself in another. The skills honed at Camp Sherman were now used to treat injuries born of pure hatred, gunshot wounds, deep cuts, and burns. She worked with the same tireless dedication she'd shown during the pandemic. There, in the halls of Provident, the nature of her fight became clear. The battle against the flu and the battle against racial violence were two fronts in the same war, public health crises fueled by systemic inequality. Her fight wasn't just for a place in a hospital, but for the health, safety, and dignity of her people. The Red Summer cooled, leaving scars that would take decades to heal. For Esther and her colleagues, the path forward remained a struggle. They had proven themselves on two of the nation's most brutal battlefields, yet the doors to professional advancement remained largely shut. But something had changed. They had worn the uniform and earned respect. They could no longer be dismissed as unqualified. They had set a precedent. This experience galvanized the National Association of Colored Graduate Nurses, NACGN. Led by women like Ada Toms and, later, Mabel Stoppers, they intensified their advocacy, using the story of the 18 nurses as a testament to their patriotism and skill. The fight was long. When World War II erupted, the same story began again. A desperate need for nurses and an initial refusal to accept black women. But this time, the NACGN was ready. Mabel Stoppers launched a relentless campaign, lobbying the White House and shaming the government for its discriminatory policies. She pointed to the nurses of 1918 as proof of their readiness to serve. Her efforts worked. In 1945, the U.S. Army and Navy Nurse Corps were officially and permanently opened to black nurses. In 1948, President Truman desegregated the entire military. By 1951, the NACGN, having achieved its primary goal of integration into the American Nurses Association, triumphantly voted to dissolve itself. The legacy of that first call in 1918 lives on in the careers of women like Della Rainey, the first black nurse commissioned as a lieutenant, and Hazel Johnson Brown, who became the first black female general and chief of the Army Nurse Corps. A single phone call can't change the world, but it can change a life, and a changed life can set forces in motion. For the woman we called Esther, and for the 17 real-life heroes she represents, that desperate call in 1918 was more than a job offer. It was a challenge and an opportunity. They answered that call not knowing what they would face. They walked into the heart of a plague, armed with their training and surrounded by prejudice. They saved lives, endured segregation, and emerged with unshakable resolve. They then faced the fires of racial hatred at home and continued to serve. Their story is a stark reminder that in crisis, our true character is revealed. A nation's character was revealed in its reluctance to accept them, and their character was revealed in their willingness to serve anyway. They fought for more than just the lives of their patients. They fought for their right to care, their place in their profession, and the soul of a country that didn't always deserve their patriotism. They were pathfinders, and their legacy echoes in every hospital where a nurse of color cares for a patient. Their presence a testament to a battle fought and won.